Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's webinar from the ADI&JC training team. Tonight's webinar is terminology and do you mean what you say? We're going to try and clear up a few confusions that may be out there and help you with some understandings with the training team here. And we have a special guest tonight. We have Professor Peter Russell with us tonight, standing in on this webinar, sitting in on this webinar. So welcome to the team tonight, Peter. If you would just like to give a brief introduction of yourself, please.
Yes, I've been most things in most on. Initially, from an NJC point of view, I was the founder secretary and the founder training officer of the NJC way back in 1973. And since then, I've occupied a number of spaces. I was training director at BSF. I was director general of the Motorsport Association, and I was general secretary of the DIA in the old days. So I've been around quite a bit. I was also one of the two ADIs that was sent on the driving examiner course in 1967 with Pat Murphy, who was then the president of the ADI-NJC, and we were at that time informed of how the DSA were going to help us. And surely enough, they allowed us to go on one of their three of their courses altogether, a driving examiner's course, then a supervising examiner's course, and eventually a driving examiner's conference. And we did those three as guests of the Driving Standards Driving Standards Agency. Since then, the whole lot's got across, of course.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much, Peter. James, quick introduction.
I'm membership secretary and head of training for ADI&JC. So, all in all, tonight we've got a current head of training and two past heads of training. Been a driving instructor for 20 plus years. Trained driving instructors. We'll stop boring people there, I think.
Yeah, lovely. And Nick, quick introduction, please.
Good evening, everyone. Nick Hibbert. I'm Vice President of the ADI&JC, run my own driving school, which I've done for 33 years. Train people like James and Ed to become driving instructors, plus help instructors with their standards check.
Thank you. And I'm Ed Marshall. I'm your presenter for tonight, and trying to keep things in order, keep things moving along swiftly, and help everything along go tonight. Been an instructor since 2001, 2002 area, and I too do instructor training, and I'm on the training team, as you can see, for the ADI&JC as well as the governing committee. So welcome everybody tonight. Okay, so next slide. So goals for tonight. A little bit of a statement there. Most misunderstandings in the world could be avoided if people would simply take the time to ask, what else could this mean? And the goals for tonight. We're going to look at the importance of communication and getting it right to help learners learn at the best, and look at how interpretations maybe happen and some common misunderstandings that can go along. We're going to bring into it a little bit of some of our experience that we've had along the way as well, and look at some common sayings and phrases and maybe help you with those, maybe some that you might hear, and making communication clear. A little bit of an overview at the end of making communication clear. And for this webinar, we have a handout that we're going to email out to you all as well afterwards. From John Farlam. He sent us some information that we can send out to everybody that's attended tonight as a thank you for attending. So, the importance of communication and helping the learner to learn. Now, we're just off air. We were just having a bit of a discussion before we came on air, and Peter came up with something that he'd just like you to hear about, just some of the words and the meanings behind words. If you'd like to take up on that, and it was to do with learnt and learned, I think, wasn't it, Peter, that we were talking about?
Can I say at the beginning, I'm a professor of driver education. And as such, the whole of my career has been spent building up my own qualifications and basis. And as an English teacher and an English chief examiner for the AEB and after them the AQA, one of my roles has been marking people's spelling and uses of words. And driving instructors, unfortunately, and I'm being very general now, but driving instructors have a rather bad habit of teaching all they know and then expecting the pupils to know all that they know. And what we're looking at are the differences between the word learned, L-E-A-R-N-T, and learned, L-E-A-R-N-E-D. If something is learned, you said it to the pupil, and the pupil's able to say it back to you or even do it back to you. Let's take an example, getting into the car. The instructor sits in the car, holds the keys in his lap, says to the pupil, right, I'd like you to walk around the car, enter the door safely, open the door safely, get in, close the door correctly, making sure it goes on double click or whatever you want to say is your extra bits there. And then adjust your seat, and then adjust your mirror, and then adjust your seat belt, and then you're ready to switch on. And the pupil can quite often do that because they've got a short-term memory which works. They can remember those things, especially if they're associated with a phrase that goes D-treble-S-M. I don't know if anybody remembers that one. Doors, seatbelt, mirrors. Oh, that was so I'll put it in the middle of seatbelt.
We'll come to that. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Okay, that's the thing. But the snag is, next time they get in, you've seen your pupil once, they come back a week later, they've had a few nights out with the lads, they spent 3 fruitless hours watching television, football, they come home crying, they can't see properly, they get in the car, you say, okay, do the safety checks, they look at you. But you learned it last week, they say. Oh, that, they say. You say, well, show me, and they can't, because they haven't learned it. They've only learned so they can reproduce it back for you when you tell them. So one of the essences of teaching and learning is that you teach as much as you possibly can in the time that you've got and within the scope of the pupil to actually learn what you've said to them. And if it's learned, they'll come back next week and put it into practice. And if it's learned, they'll never need to be told by you again whether to do it. So you can measure your own skill as a teacher by saying to a pupil or saying to yourself when you've got a pupil, have I taught you this before? You're not asking them before. And if you say yes, or if they say yes, you taught it me before, you say, well, why can't you remember it? Putting the onus back on them. In other words, you've got to make them think between lessons as well as during the lesson. So learned means one thing, which means you can actually do something under control and under direction. But learned is something you remember for the rest of your life. And,
so, Pete, would you say that's the difference between coaching and instructing?
Yes, I would. In fact, coaching is the essence of saying put everything into proper perspective. You know, you've done something, but you haven't done it properly, and I'm going to help you do it properly every time. But I shall stop telling you. For instance, you must never expect me to teach you how to get in the car safely once you've moved on to manoeuvres, because you'll be able to do that every time you're required.
It's moving things from the long term to the short term in the main of it, isn't it? It's getting that transfer from one side of the brain going down deeper, so it goes into the subconscious and becomes automatic, really. Yeah.
Believe you me, if ever you put your hand in a boiling hot kettle of water, you won't do it again because you learned really hard. But it's a bad way to teach.
Is that the big stick that's coming out there?
Yeah.
The carrot and the big stick. Right. Okay. Thanks for that, Peter. Yeah. Nice explanation. But that's similar to what we're wanting to go through this evening, where there's a difference between two things, and quite often with the English language, one of the things about English language is that quite often one word can mean two different things as well. And that can get quite confusing. And we were talking about some mnemonics earlier on where we were able to come up with a mnemonic that meant two different things. So it's going to be looking at what we can do to make things clearer as we go through. For example, like this one on the board now, I know Nick and I had a little bit of a difference. I use MSPSL, and Nick uses MSMPSL if he was going to use it, although I very rarely do use these mnemonics. But we're going to be looking at different frameworks behind how we can help the learner learn different things in communication. What do you think the reason is, Nick? I'll come to you with this one, that instructors have gone, seems to be in this world, instructors go mad with mnemonics. Any ideas why that is?
I think it was at some point back in time, it seemed to be a good idea or way for people to retain and remember things just by those letters. Whether that is true and they can recite it, because that's basically what they're doing, reciting it. But as Peter's already said, can they actually apply it? So it's all very good saying MSM or MSPSL. They can say what it is, or usually they get the two S's around the wrong way, don't they? And that's always a good indication. If they get the two S's around the wrong way, you know they're not going to slow down. So they say mirrors, or mirror, as some of them say, then signal, then position, then signal, then look. But if you're listening carefully, you'll know they've said it wrong.
Yeah.
And as you know, when we're teaching part 3s to PDIs, and they may ask us MSPSL or MSMPSL, in our teaching roles, we'll give the wrong answer back, won't we? To see if they are listening.
Yeah, see if they are listening.
So why people use all these different mnemonics? Maybe it's because it's too hard for an instructor, and I'm thinking outside the box here, to write all that down longhand. So it's just easier to simplify it. One of the other reasons could be, and Peter will come back to this, is that years ago on the DL25, it was only letters that were used. There was nothing written out. In fact, the learner driver, when they unfortunately failed a driving test, never actually saw the failure sheet. Did they, Peter? They didn't. It was all recorded in letters, and there was no point in showing it to anyone. They wouldn't have understood it.
Everybody used to say that they didn't see the examiner filling in his football pools, which is what they thought he was doing, because driving instructors were never given the examiner's marking sheet until 1967, and it was only then that we were allowed to use examiner's terminology and teach pupils exactly what the examiner was about to say on test. And in fact, I was...
So that's... Go on, Peter, yeah, sorry.
I was threatened with publishing the against the rules of the hang on, I've lost the track there.
Establishment, yes. They would take you to task if you'd have published those things, because it was confidential and you had to sign Official Secrets Act, probably.
Right.
So there's a possibility that it stemmed from that.
Yeah, when the chief examiner threatened with me because I published a book with the Official Secrets words in, he said, you've made public words which you've never allowed reaching to the wider public. And I said, well, that means every one of your examiners breaks the law 6 times a day. So I never heard any more after that.
Yeah. James, how have you found, when you're doing your training with driving instructors, how have you found that people have taken on board mnemonics? Have they found it easy to learn in that way, or do some people find it harder learning?
I think it varies, but I think one of the potential problems with them is that it is a question that do both parties know what they mean. Mm. So if a learner has been taught a particular phrase or mnemonic, and another driving instructor is using a different phrase or mnemonic, then they're speaking 2 different languages. We've already taught this evening, Peter was talking about getting in the car and getting everything ready. Now, some people will call that a cockpit drill. Some people will call it safety checks. So if a learner has learned how to do the cockpit drill, if they swap instructors and are told to do their safety checks, you might get a blank look.
Yeah, they might start checking the mirrors and the blind spot and driving off.
Yeah.
Just to say that our attendees can type in questions. I'm not sure if you mentioned
Oh no, I
that to
didn't
them.
mention that.
So anything, yeah, if they've got any questions or want to come back to us with anything, then they can type that in. Would you like to explain how
Yes.
that's done?
Yeah. Thanks, Nick, for pointing that out. Moving on a bit swiftly there, weren't we? Yeah, on the control panel on your PCs, if you look at the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side, so far down there's a drop-down box which says questions in there. I know Frank's found it already, but Frank's familiar with this. And Frank's just typed in "Hi all," so hi there, Frank, and I can send a message back privately, or I can send it back to everybody. But if you've got any questions, type the questions in there, or if you've got, as we're going through, if you've got any comments that you want to ask, or any anecdotes you want us to talk out, anything that's happened to you personally, type them in there, and as we go through the webinar, I'll bring these in and ask the panel, or you can direct a question directly at one of the panel as well. So type away with your questions. Thanks for pointing that out, Nick. And we'll move on. Technical information, that's quite a common one where a lot of learners might get a bit of a blank look. I've had some blank looks before when we start talking about some of the technical information, and it's important to sort of be clear with how you're talking about the technical information. How do you approach that when you're talking about that then, James, when you're going through technical information?
I tend to move not use mnemonics very often, or acronyms. I would prefer to actually try to use as simple plain English as I can, and actually explain something rather than using shorthand. I think we all have jargon. Every profession has jargon, and it's fine as long as both people speaking, well, both people communicating with one another, both understand what that jargon is.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with somebody that perhaps isn't in on what something means, you've got to speak in plain English, and that's what I tend to try to do as much as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Has anybody? Go on, Peter.
Ed, can I take that back on stage?
Yes, you can.
Because one of the problems that driving instructors had immediately post-war is that most driving instructors had either worked for BSM for years and hidden in the woodwork until the end of the war, or they'd been in the army in the Royal Corps of Transport teaching lorry drivers. And of course, any lorry driver will know that you let the clutch out when you take your foot off, and you put it in when you're separating it. And sort of what I would have termed military driving instructors were so forced in their way of using vocabulary that they said, let the clutch out. Whereas what they meant is, the clutch is coming in, it's going to be engaged. And it's that sort of technology which I found very difficult. But I found that driving instructors themselves were quite often the cause of this. Because what they did, they said something that they'd been taught without understanding. And if I can go back to when James said cockpit drill, I can almost guarantee that any driving instructor post-war that taught cockpit drill had been trained at BSM, because the former chief of training at BSM before I became training director was an ex-pilot, and he wrote books on flying, and therefore everything had a cockpit drill, and that was what BSM were taught right up to 1974. And only then did they realise that, well, we're not going to a cockpit drill, are we?
Would you not say that you've obviously got to look at your student and decide how much technical information your student either needs or would actually glean from it? And I'll take this to possibly English as not being their first language. How deep do you go into this? Even if English is their first language, how deep do you go into it? And I mean, it's a minefield now with ABS, ESP, and all these other gizmos, and different manufacturers even call different things by different letters, don't they? But they mean the same thing.
And I know driving instructors spent hours teaching that the braking system, ABS, anti-blockade system, it was actually an abbreviation for, And the kind that I was explaining, the anti-blockage system was actually a system which enabled you to stop quicker, which of course is not true. Anti-blockage system, all it allowed you to do was to steer and then brake and then steer and then brake, but at such a high speed that you were able to do two things at once.
Yeah. Yeah. So how much do you spend much time going through those different sort of things with learners then, Nick? Because I know you still do quite a lot of learners. With mechanical information such as just there's DSC, there's all sorts of different ones that actually go into stabilizing the car, traction control units. How much do you go into detail with that?
Obviously, because the traction control light might illuminate and certainly should come on when they first fire up the engine, we'd have to make sure they understood what all the lights are that come up on the dashboard and what they possibly could do. But how deep you go into that really would depend, as I said already, on the students' level of interest to start with and benefit to them in a way. The downside, of course, is that newer drivers are used to all this power steering, power assisted brakes as we might use, or servo assisted brake systems, disc brakes, which none of us ever had when we were learning to drive, and we see them as an aid to improving driving, whereas probably some newer drivers see that as just the norm, and the car braking for itself or cruise control will just become the norm, which is a bit disconcerting, isn't it? So, and therefore, they again, like seat belts being on the car, people then push the speed that little bit more, take a higher risk and with airbags, so they push that envelope a little bit more. Whereas if you took all those things away, they might well drive a bit slower.
Well, I think that's a really good point that you've brought up, and isn't it a case in some of the rallying stages as that's developed, and I know through F1 as well, cars have got so much better and so much safer that people have pushed the boundaries and then killed themselves because they've pushed beyond what they can do. And in some cases, they've actually they've gone back to restricting the output that some of the engines are making. I mean, if you take, for instance, there was I can't remember what it was called now, but it was the Mini Metro Type 1 back in the 80s, late 80s in rallying. Yeah, and it was absolutely, that's the one. So what, James?
The engine was in the middle. Yeah, it got so powerful that even the rally drivers couldn't cope with it.
Yeah.
So technology moves along, and it's hard for a lot of people just to keep up with what it can do. And the buzzword at the moment, and James will smile when I say this, is platooning. I mean, how technical in information, and how much information do you want to give people about that? I mean,
I think that's another webinar on its own.
We'll leave that. A whole webinar on that.
Yeah, no, we've got that one lined up. So for people that have just heard that one, we've digressed a little bit onto platooning, which is going to be hopefully another webinar coming up shortly. But that's something that we had a really interesting talk at the ADI&JC Association meeting about the future, and it's coming in very shortly as well, isn't it? In places, isn't that going to be expected within the next 3 years?
I mean, you I'm not advertising the Tesla, but it's such an amazing car, and it can virtually now drive itself already. So, how much if you had one of them as a driving school car, how much technical information and mechanical information are you going to give your student, other than saying turn on the engine and it will go on its own?
Yeah.
Every kind. With the clutch, I think one of the things that's most important is to get an understanding of how the clutch functions. And Peter said very nicely about clutch in, clutch out, dip the clutch is another one people say. So I think it's an important aspect because it is a component of the car, obviously the manual car, that is going to wear out if it's abused. and to give some car sympathy and understanding. And there's some great little apps out there that you could get on your tablet or whatever, to actually play with that and get them to do it. It's you could spend most of the lesson doing that, though. That's the only problem.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's getting that balance.
And I will always explain the clutch from a diagram in a book or from my download from my tablet that I've got, and the app from that. Because I think you need that kind of visual thing there. It's next to impossible to describe how a clutch is functioning without some sort of visual aid, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And I think, well, we've been talking about the mechanical side of it, and something that Peter will have been very familiar with is dry steering, and Peter will have had many reasons for teaching somebody not to dry steer, whereas dry steering now is sort of more widely accepted. Yes, Peter.
Sorry about that. Especially the chap who lives next door to me, who drives a very big, wide-wheeled BMW, and every time he reverses and comes across my front of my drive, he digs a little hole with his tyres when he dry steers, because the steering is so powerful that a 2-ton car can be steered quite easily without moving the body forward at all, and the wheels just spin round according to what he thinks he needs. But yeah, dry steering is in fact stupid because you're wearing the tyres out at a fantastic rate. But yeah.
And I would actually say worse than that, Peter. It's not just necessarily flat spotting the tyre, although there's some people might disagree with that. But I think your example of a much heavier car is a good one, as opposed to maybe some of the lighter, smaller cars that driving instructors might use. But my concern is the side wall of the tyre is being weakened, let alone not just the tread. And I think people don't realise how, if they understood how the construction of the tyre was made up, and that at higher speed, when the tyre gets hot, why the tyre may burst at higher speeds. And they would stop doing dry steering. And I must say, I do cringe when I see instructors doing that. But I will, as an instructor, I will not allow my student to dry steer, because I think it's bad for the vehicle. Plus, of course, they're doing unseen damage to the steering joints and mechanisms. They don't realise. But of course, people, if you like, and I'm not criticising BSM, but let's take them as an example because Peter keeps mentioning them. They'll keep the car, 6 months and get rid of it. They're not going to keep the car for X number of years, like somebody when they buy their car might keep it for a while, and before they know it, they take it for an MOT and it doesn't pass because the steering's too loose. And that's something else that they're not encouraging the learner driver to have some sort of car sympathy, because they themselves don't keep the car that long. That's my view.
Yeah.
James?
Thank you.
I'd agree with your view.
Yeah. Anything to add on that one? Anything to add, James?
I'm not sure I have on that point now.
Right, that's fine. Stephen Smith has just come up with a point directed at Peter. Peter, James trained with BSM in 1993 and was still taught to use the cockpit drill, so it's still going in 93 when...
Of course it does. I mean, we had 25 staff instructors. They were all great blokes. They all had their own idiosyncrasies. For instance, one of them was a former Part 3 examiner for the old supervising test. And he then became a respected member of the BSM team. I won't mention his name here now, but I always remember that he used to park under Putney Bridge while he went for a smoke. One of the things I banned was smoking in cars by either instructors or pupils. This is long before it was made illegal. And he used to leave his pupils sitting on the foreshore under Putney Bridge where they start the boat race, and while he went for a quick smoke. And he came back one day to find the tide had come in, and as he shouted to people, "Don't open the door, you've now got a perfectly good reason why you always think before you shout." They only heard the bits "open the door," so he did, and he was flooded. The people who were sitting in the driving suddenly had a lap full of Putney water. But yeah, oh absolutely, driving instructors are probably the worst people. I'm sorry. at keeping things going rather than thinking them through themselves.
Yeah.
Against that, new driving instructors quite often are better than the old ones, because I always quote this about teachers. I know teachers who've got 20 years experience. I also know driving instructors who've got 1 year's experience 20 times repeated, and that's not necessarily good teaching. But
Thanks,
anyway,
Peter.
that's
Yep.
Rich.
Right. Andy C has come up with quite an interesting one. I don't know if any of the panel have heard of this one. Have you used clothes pegs to demonstrate how a clutch works? I take it what Andy's meaning there is how the pegs can squash together quite easily. It's an interesting analogy to use a clothes peg. I've not heard of that one. Anybody else heard of a clothes peg?
No, but it sounds good. That's quite intriguing. I like the sound of that, and I can visualise the analogy on that. That's really good. And getting a pupil to open it, and then very, very gently get it to close. Yeah,
because it's got the resistance there. Yeah.
I'm just going to go to the kitchen and get some clothes pegs out. I mean, this is a wonder what the hell I'm doing.
But when they're practicing that, it must be awfully difficult to put the hands down on the left foot in order to clothes peg on the coast.
So,
Very good. I like
I'll just move on to the next one. And as we've said, the main thing, importance of communication and what we're doing is to avoid confusion with the pupils, and trying to get some clarity. So think back to your training for those of the attendees out there. Think back to when you were actually training to become a driving instructor, and how did you feel when you first started hearing some of these? So just for the guys that are on the panel, going back to when you first started training, we'll come in with James on this one. Can you remember when you started training, James, and your trainer started asking you or talking to you about different things? Were you 100% clear what they were talking about all the time, or did you find yourself a little bit confused?
I think there was initially some confusion that they were assuming that they're just really assuming that you know things, so they're using the terminology. So even simple things, it's working out. You just put up assumption of prior knowledge. So simple term like meeting. And, well, what exactly is meeting? Isn't that where we sit around the table and we all talk?
usually in Piccadilly Circus.
Yeah. Then have their own definition of dealing with junctions or emerging. And hold on, what's the difference? And that was really just for the terminology for part 3. So, yeah, it's a foreign language, isn't it? That's coming from the outside, and they know the jargon, they know the language, and you're having to catch up because they just assume you know.
Yeah, I often when I'm training doing part 3 training, I say, remember when we first started doing this? As when they're trying to explain to me as the pupil, they're trying to explain something, and I've got this confused, glazed look over my face when they're not explaining something very clearly, and that soon makes them sort of think back to how they first felt. So I think it's quite important for us to reflect back on how we felt as we were trainers, to help us understand how the pupils sat at the side of us are sometimes feeling while they're there. Yeah. What about you, Nick? Is there anything that stands out for you when you were training?
Yeah, the word stop, we should always try and use the word stop in the appropriate time. Although I must confess, I will, in the course of a discussion with a student while they're driving, probably use the word stop, but they don't suddenly slam the brake on. But I do understand why it has to be careful. And one of the things you've got to be careful of saying is don't stop.
Yeah. And the other one I was always told about was be careful how you use the word right.
Indeed.
Right, you're right there.
Yeah.
I agree with you. That's right.
Correct.
Yes. We do that. No, we do that in our workshop, our standards check workshop. Yeah. We put up this sort of thing. I'd like you to, right?
Yeah.
One of the other things I was always encouraged not to say was the word never. Try never to use the word never.
It's funny because Helen has actually put on here, never assume.
Yes.
Yeah.
It makes an ass of me.
And James, you're right about meeting. I think PDIs do get that confused, and so do the learners. But the other one that is very confusing is oncoming traffic. And a lot of PDIs or even learners say, well, the vehicle coming from my left or my right is oncoming. Yes, but they're not. In the DVSA's speak, they mean coming towards you. So
It's
a
funny
vehicle
you should
coming
say
from the right,
that, Nick, because
oncoming in one sense.
when you had
Go
that
on.
conversation, when we were at having that meeting the other day at Newport, and you said about that, I've never had anybody call traffic coming from my right or my left oncoming traffic until this week. And it funny how it
Well,
was
there
just
you
after that meeting, and I suddenly just thought back to then when you said about that. I thought, now whether that's because I've not actually ever recognised it that somebody said that, and I've just automatically corrected it, but it was really weird how that one stood out the other day that they actually talked about oncoming traffic from the right, and I said no, that's crossing traffic.
But doesn't it show how we slot into that terminology? And I suppose for consistency, if you are using a similar or the same terminology as DVSA and therefore an examiner, it does make life easier for the learner.
Yeah,
I.e., if you alert, direct, identify, or identify, alert, direct, whichever way around you want to say it, Peter will correct me on that, because he probably invented that one, you know, as opposed to take the next turn on the left. And you'll end up in someone's driveway,
yep,
as opposed to I'd like you to take the next road on the left, and using the word road as opposed to turning. Peter,
yes,
you want to come in on that?
Yes, have I got time to come in and tell you a very true story very quickly?
Yeah,
A
of course.
chap called Dean. Anyway, his first name was Dean, and he was a training manager at BSM when I first took over. And one of the things I had to do was sit in the car with 3 trainees, all in the Ford Escort. So there were 5 of us in the Ford Escort, and I was usually the one squeezed in the middle in the back seat. And he was driving along through back streets of Putney, and having spent about an hour or so explaining why you give the correct sequence, at the end of the road, I would like to turn right, please. He suddenly said to one of his pupils, instructors, turn right at the end. And before he got any further, people did a hard right turn and went straight up the drive of this old-fashioned house. And we went in and we stopped within 3 centimetres of an old Citroën DS, the old Duchess cars. And I looked to see the person sitting standing in the garden, working in the garden, was Neris Hughes, who in those days was the she played the role of a district nurse in one of the television programmes. And she was typically Welsh, and anyway, she waddled across to us, very heavily pregnant. And as she got closer, Dean immediately lowered her window and he said, not my fault, love. He said, I said, turn right at the end of the road, and he turned right in your drive. He said, oh, Dean, lad, you're early this week, aren't you? And then he said, yeah, I've got one of the directors in the back with me. It's his fault because he should have stopped me. That's how you learn. At the end of the road, turn right, please. Or take the second road on the left. This is the first, which is the way examiners would do it. But going back to other things on user words, one of the other ADI's trainee staff instructors, if ever he was told to get into top gear, he immediately put both feet on his pedals, braking, gear, clutch, and stop. And some old boy, riding his bike behind us, ran straight into the back of us. And Percy lowered his in passenger window. You see, I'm terribly sorry, he said, but I'm trying to teach this chap to be a driving instructor, and he's not learning very well. And the old boy looks at him and he says, oh, sorry, Percy was in the passenger seat because he'd been, sorry, in the driving seat because he'd been learning to be a driving instructor with a trainee instructor teaching him. And Percy looked at him and he said, well, I can't help. He said, he told me to stop here. And the instructor was saying, oh, I said, stop doing it. And the old boy looked on, we bent his bike over and pulled up and said to Percy, what's a silly old buffer like you're doing learning to drive anyway? But you can get terrific confusion by...
That's a good one. So you're saying top gear and somebody mishears it and thinks it's stop here.
Stop it.
And we
Yeah.
have, again, in our workshop, we use the term and brake, but if you said it
Yeah.
quickly in a London accent, it might be hand brake.
Yeah, handbrake.
Yeah.
Clutch, handbrake.
Over familiarity. What's this one?
I think that's where we become we're over familiar with the terms that we use, and we're so much involved with the training that we do. I think sometimes it's very easy to forget that when we get a new driver sat at the side of us, it's easy just to come out and keep going and be in our own world and forget about the person that sat next to us sometimes. Um, I've come across it where that's happened when we've been doing some check test training with somebody, and the instructors quite happily chatting away to themselves, and we've lost the learner because the trainer hasn't recognised that the learner's drifted away because they don't understand some of the terms that's being used.
Eyes glazed over.
Eyes glazed over, exactly, Peter. Yeah. So it's very easy for us to become familiar, and through communication, it's really important to keep an eye on our learners and watch for their body language when they do glaze over. I think that is the reason that I put over familiarity on that.
Incidentally, on that, one of the other problems is fathers are not very helpful. They've got their little sayings as well, and if their little daughter or little son is learning to drive, if you go into a skid, both feet out, they used to say.
Yeah.
Which of course immediately.
That's what I was always taught.
That was the cause of the skid. And in fact, the only time I ever did that deliberately was when I was teaching people how to cope with ABS. Put them on a nice rough road where there's a bit of shale around or gravel, and then say to them, put the clutch down, now hit the brake as hard as you can. And that's when they get that chatter that comes with the ABS. And once it's happened to you, you recognise it, and you'll never have that happen to you again because you'll recognise what you've done. You've locked the wheels, and therefore you can't steer, then you're going to hit a tree. So if you can do that with them, that was the thing I used to use deliberately as a means of teaching people what not to do in an emergency.
Yeah.
But with a skid, you've also got saying steer into a skid, and so many people don't understand what they mean by it.
Sorry, say that again, James. James, just start that one again, please.
In relation to skidding, people have often heard of the phrase steer into the skid. They've heard it, but they don't really understand what it means or how to do it or when to do it. It's just they've picked up the phrase.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do you overcome that one, James?
Have a conversation. Ask them what they mean, and so that we would then have a conversation about skid avoidance and skid correction.
Yeah.
Both with ABS and without.
Yeah.
But please remember, never do it when they're driving. Never give training on something as important as that while the pupil's actually concentrating on stopping the wheel falling out of their hand. Or, I mean, when I used to sell my cars, I used to explain to people the reason I had to sell it is when I bought the car, it was brand new, the steering wheel was absolutely smooth at the back. But now I need to sell it because if they run their fingers around the back, they'll feel it's got little ribs all the way around. And of course, they'd never noticed that before. And I say, I've got to sell it because you spoiled the steering wheel for me. And it's where people try to talk and teach and drive all at the same time.
Is that them grouping on for their life?
Yes.
Yeah. Right, giving directions. Yeah, I think we've actually covered a little bit of this, haven't we? Is be clear when we're giving the directions. Has anybody got anything they want to add to that?
Well, only that it's so easy for some people to, even learners. I had one say it to me today, do you want me to go straight over the roundabout? And I said, no, I'd rather you drive around it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the terms straight on at the roundabout or straight over the roundabout, or it's like over the traffic lights. Should we not drive between them? You want me to go over the traffic lights? No, I want you to go past them.
I've never had somebody literally go over a roundabout because I said straight on at the roundabout. I didn't do it again.
I've actually asked somebody to turn right at the roundabout, and they did turn right at the roundabout. They tried to attempt to go the wrong way round it. And my cousin actually did it on a driving test, and the examiner did let her go the wrong way around the roundabout. And she did turn right at the roundabout, exactly as requested. And she wondered why she'd failed. So, yeah, it is being clear and getting... It's like the alert directive, inform direct, isn't it? So it's been clear with the
And of course,
directions.
giving them at an appropriate time. And I think that's one of the nice things about independent driving, because it does make the learner driver think about the timing of the mirror and their signal, as opposed to us saying at the end of the road turn right. That's the trigger point for them to start doing everything. And I remember a lad, as soon as I said it, he would begin indicating. So one day I said to him, at the roundabout, turn right, leave by the third exit. And he started indicating. I said, what are you indicating for? He said, well, you asked me to turn right at the roundabout. I said, the roundabout's a mile away.
Yeah, yeah.
Incidentally,
Go on,
with
Peter.
regard to free driving, I've always made I ran the driving school for 30 years before I joined VSM. I always made all of my pupils stop at a petrol station and pull in and get the fuel and load it up. And I used to tell them exactly how much money they could spend. And I'd give them a £5 note and say, right, or whatever, a pound note or whatever it was, and put that much petrol in. And if it goes any more, you've got to pay for it yourself. And they actually soon learned how to cook. And the other thing is, of course, has happened to me on one occasion. I went into a petrol station to fill up, and a young lady came across me from her Ford Zephyr. And she said, could you help me? And I said, yes. You run a driving school? I said, yeah. She said, well, how do I put petrol in my Ford Zephyr? And I never driven one before, but I looked at it, of course, that was the old steering column gear change. And as I walked around the back, it's purely by incident that I noticed that the number plate stuck out of it.
It was on
and
it.
when you put the plate back, there was a petrol filler. Yeah.
Yeah.
But to help her at that time.
Yeah, quite an interesting comment that we've got from Helen. One thing that Helen's put on here is learning to operate a vehicle is a very experiential process. And I think that's quite an important thing now, is that getting that experience in there is really good, Helen. Yeah, so it's a good point that you've brought across. Helen also finds it difficult talking about skid talk can be difficult, so she uses lots of hand gestures and diagrams, and encourages the use of video footage. Yeah, and that's the modern style of teaching now, isn't it? We're bringing in the use of video and the apps and everything like that. It's great for people to be able to get a lot more help with what, like we were talking about, James, when you were talking about the skids. It's good to send them away and look at the videos and look at apps that can help with that. And even some of the experiences days now, and I know this is a bit of a controversial one, where people say it's not good to maybe get somebody in a car and create skids, because that leads to maybe some overconfidence. But I used to train in a skid car, and the amount of people that said they'd really got a lot out of the day was brilliant. And some of the comments we used to get fed back afterwards, how it had made them think about speed more. Has anybody got any thoughts on that sort of way of training and getting people to think about things like that?
Yeah, I think it put somebody in that sort of situation, because as Peter mentioned earlier on, you fill up a bucket of boiling hot water and get somebody to put their hand in it, they won't do it again. And it's the same sort of thing. Put them into a risky situation, but obviously manage the risk. And yeah, hopefully they learn from that experience.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have much bad weather. We're not around my way, so I can't remember the last bit of snow we had. But I'll always teach in ice and snow. I think it's one of the best and most fun times to teach driving. And I would say to them, right, there's not quite a bit of road. We'll put the car in the centre of the road, and we'll just nip the handbrake up slightly and see what it does. Even though I'm not sure sometimes which way we're going to go, but it's instant reaction and how they steer to correct it. Their instant reflexes. But if you had said to somebody, if the back of a car steps out to the right, which way will you steer? They have to stop and think about it. Put them in the situation, and they'll react immediately.
Yeah. I found that when I was...
The absolute essential to remember with skiing is what you look at, you will hit.
Yes.
And I always remember one of my he was the father of one of my pupils, but he was also deputy head of education in Hampshire, I think. And he came in to see me one afternoon in one of my classes. And he said, Peter, I must tell you, you know what you taught my daughter about skidding? Where you look is where you go. He said, I've just half an hour ago driving in and got into a skid, and I looked between two trees and I wedged the car between them. Well, he didn't crash the car because he couldn't get out of it.
It's an essential point, isn't it, to look where you steer? Absolutely. It's one of the first things I was taught when I was doing some rally training. Don't look at the trees. Definitely look at the roadway you want to put it.
Yeah. Don't look at, because that's look at whatever you say. Don't look at.
Yeah. Well, actually, when I talk about how I said that, don't look at. That actually leads us on to quite nicely some information that John Farlam sent. And it's when you're delivering feedback is such things as don't bring the clutch up and it's not so good to be braking late. That's what we're going to look at in this next little bit. It's common sayings and phrases that we talked about, and we're going to come back to the John Farlam piece in a little bit after this. Mnemonics and phrases, I think we've talked quite a bit about that, how there's so many of them out there. Just think about how you actually use the mnemonics and phrases and make sure that your pupils are understanding what we're talking about. I typed these two together, and this is a one for you, Nick. I'm going to let you talk about this one because it's a little pet hate of yours.
Well, only a full brake's a 2-second rule?
Yeah.
Or 2-second gap? You don't know which way around it. My view is I think that's a very negative statement, and I would prefer, and I personally use the term, am I a safe distance, am I a safe distance, because I think that's a much more positive way of getting that same message or rule across. But it is interesting when you say to a student, do you know what I mean by the 2-second rule or the 2-second gap, and they'll all say 2 car lengths. Try it, people. Tomorrow, when you're out on your lessons, just ask, what do I mean if I said the word 2-second gap or 2-second rule, either phrase, and they'll all say 2 car lengths.
I quite often just ask it. I totally agree with you there, Nick. I just asked one today when we were following the car down the A64, and it was absolutely sheeting down with rain. Surface water stood on the road, and I said to my pupil, what sort of distance what's happened to the stopping distance and the rule from following that car? And they went, oh, it's double because we've got water on the road. So I said, well, what would you do about that saying? And they went, oh, it's only a fool breaks the 4-second rule now, isn't it? And I just looked at them and stayed quiet, and then suddenly they dawned on them that it's say the rule twice, isn't it? It doesn't just extend to saying the rule for 4 seconds. So they then had to say the rule twice. So they totally lost the plot a little bit, and they felt a little bit embarrassed after that. But they soon realised that they needed to change the distance they were from the vehicle in front.
Incidentally,
yes, Peter.
The person that brought the 2-second rule into public knowledge was Jimmy Savile, who used to do adverts for BSN. And he was the one that brought that front click every trip, if you remember,
yes.
For the seatbelt.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
A lot of people listened to that and believed it. I mean, personally, nobody should think in terms of a 2-second rule, because that applies to a good driver, a good road surface, good conditions, good visibility, everything totally in your favour. And yet it's not, because when you have to do an emergency or stop quickly, it's because some of those systems are not working. You may have bald tyres, you may have things. And from my point of view, you say only a fool breaks the 10-second rule 5 times.
Some other common sayings there, where there's a man, there's a van, and where there's a ball, there's a child. There's some useful sayings that you can use. The peep and creep, or creep and peep, and expect the unexpected. Narrower the gap, slower you go, less vision, less speed. So those are some of the common sayings and phrases that we'll probably use every day, and build on those to help build some scenarios as well. Those are really good talking points to get the pupils talking with you about how they could think about conditions ahead of them. And the tyres and tarmac and tarmac and tyres. Yeah, I say it the other way around then, Nick. Yeah, so tarmac and tyres, or tyres and tarmac, and the road and rubber. Yeah, and Nick and I were just having a bit of a conversation about which way round we say that as well. Is it tyres and tarmac, or is it tarmac and tyres? I see it that you see the tarmac first and then the tyres, but Nick, you were saying that
you can't see tarmac and think about your tyres much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting one.
Yeah. So what can the trainer do to make communications more clear? Briefly, just discuss the terms with the driver. This is an overview from what we're sort of going through here. Make sure that the driver understands any terms that you're using, and make it clear to the driver that, or the pupil, the learner, it's clear. Make it clear that it's okay to ask if they don't understand. Build a good rapport with the pupil, and then they'll discuss with you when they're not feeling as though they understand things clearly.
And I would also add to that, Ed, it's not just a matter of asking once. If they still don't ask again. And I always say to my students, it doesn't matter how many times you ask. If it's 50 times and on the 51st time the penny drops and you understand and you get it, and you can apply that if that's what we're dealing with, then great. Because some people might feel embarrassed. They think, oh, I've asked this question 3 times and I'm stupid or something. Why not? Well, I would never think that.
But you're demonstrating the difference between learned and learned again, Nick, aren't you? Also,
yes. Yeah.
A pupil's only learned something when they rang you up and said, I had a terrible skid this morning in a queue of traffic on the M motorway, and I survived and got out because of how you taught me. Thank you. And it does happen if you wait long enough.
It does.
I've been doing it for 57 years now. God.
And be consistent with your communication. So you're not changing the way that you're doing it, especially when you're giving the directions like we talked earlier on. If you keep them consistent, then it's nice and clear for the pupil. As they're busy doing their driving, they don't have to think, well, how was that said last time, or try to interpret things differently. I had a case of this when I was somebody was on a driving test the other week, and the examiner was giving sort of some unusual driving directions compared to what we'd done on the driving in our driving, and my pupil found it quite disconcerting and quite uncomfortable that they were trying to work out whether it was this left or wherever the turning was. And it really put my pupil off. Thankfully, they did still pass, but they did comment on it afterwards that the directions weren't as clear as what I was giving. So,
Edward, there is an important factor there. Examiner training always said in their training, as soon as you've driven a reasonable distance, when you're stationary, make sure you stop the pupil and say, are my directions clear? Because, if they're not, I need to know. And in fact, that's the point at which the pupil can say, no, I'm sorry, I'm not quite, well, you're telling me a little bit too late, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And that was the absolute rule for examiners, because if there was a complaint afterwards that the pupil went on tests and came home and failed, and they'd said, I failed because the examiner didn't give his instructions clearly or in good time, the first thing the examiner is asked at the interview, or his interview, is, did you ask them if you were clear? And don't forget, I mean, if you watch television a lot, especially with all the politics going on at the moment, if you get somebody with a very broad Scots accent or a very broad Dublin accent, you can't always understand what they're saying in normal speech.
Mm.
And, the pupil is entitled to say, I'm sorry, I can't understand what you're saying. And it's an important thing for you to tell them that they are the person responsible for understanding what's being said. I mean, let's face it, in the first lessons, if you're from Glasgow and you've got a terrible accent and your pupil can't understand you, they're soon going to tell you they can't understand what you're saying. But they wouldn't do it.
Unless they're from Glasgow as well.
Sorry?
Unless they're from Glasgow as well,
Yes,
then they would understand you.
Yeah.
Ed, do you want to move on a bit?
Yes, yeah, we'll move this on. we'll just. Sorry, I was just looking at the questions then. Be positive in your statements, and this is one thing that we've sort of been talking about a little bit, touched on a couple of times, as to be positive in the way that you give instruction. Instead of saying "don't bring your clutch up so fast," change the way that it's been said. So it's bring your clutch up slower, yeah, or slowly bring your clutch up if you want to get it really the correct way around, so that the instructions there are nice and clear and they're simple and easy to understand. So because time is pressing on and we're at 9 o'clock now, what we'll do is we'll send this positive statements form out that John Farnham has sent out on email. And all I'd like to do is just say one final piece of information here. It's important to remember when you're training, you're training and not testing, which is a little bit what was mentioned earlier on, that the trainer has to be really clear. Well thought out communication is vital to keep a relaxed and well motivated learner. So your learner gets the best out of what they're doing. Just going to have a quick flick through some of these questions, just see if there's any points here that I need to bring up. Do you want to just have a little bit of a roundup, James, as to any views that you have for tonight?
I think it's probably you've summed up it really well on that last slide. I think it is really, as you say, make sure it's clear, and people can misunderstand things very easily. I mean, one other example that perhaps hasn't been mentioned is on a multi-lane road, which is the outside lane.
Yeah.
We often think of it. Yeah, we often think of it as drivers as being the right-hand lane or the overtaking lane as being the outside lane. But to a non-driver, logically, it's the one on the outside of the whole road, so the left lane.
Well, you mean the hard shoulder, that bit?
Yeah. If you just look at it physically, the outside lane would actually be the hard shoulder.
Yeah.
As a driver, we term it the other way round, and so it's just an easy miscommunication. And so it's the essential part of communication is that the message received is the one that you sent out, and doesn't always work.
Yeah. Thanks, James. Peter, do you want to have a little bit of a roundup of your thoughts, just very quickly?
Yeah, I'd say be consistent. You were talking about adjectives and adverbs. For instance, whenever I talk to people about using their brake, it was always gently brake. It was never brake gently, because otherwise you get a nose on the windscreen. Gently brake and then gently brake to stop tells them exactly what you want them to do. And if it's clutch coming up, it's slowly clutch up and firmly clutch down. And if you can always use those words, and apart from anything else, you're then giving pupils an intimation of what the next word's going to be. If they hear gently, they'll know it's brake. If they hear slowly, they'll know it's clutch. Sorry, the other way around.
Yeah. Well, we understand what you mean there. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Peter. Yeah, brilliant. Nick, if you'd like to just round off very quickly.
I would just agree and say, make sure, and Peter said the same thing, even on the driving test, if you think the examiner's not giving clear instruction, but the same with your instructor, and make sure you ask your student, are you understanding me? Of my instruction clear enough, early enough, or too late, too early, whatever, and have that understanding, because that's going to help their learning process a lot if they understand, and try not to get too technical and too much jargon going into everything, because most people don't want to hear all that.
No.
They want to learn to drive.
Yeah. That's it. So, right, just finally, what I'd like to do is just round off a few points that people have brought up on these questions. It's just given me time to go through. Helen, I understand it's your first webinar tonight. Welcome to the webinars. It's nice that you've enjoyed this evening. You've found it useful. Thank you for your input and your questions and what you've put forward in the question boxes here. There's a lot of useful statements there, and you're absolutely right with it. You know, lots of what you're saying there. There's a lot of information. I've brought you some of your points forward as we've gone through, but thank you very much for taking part tonight. Frank Ward had one comment here somewhere. We were talking about the 2-second gap and whether it's the 2 car lengths, and he says it's always 2 car lengths, and I think in the majority of times it is sort of said like that. Where there's a bus, there's a fuss, and where there's rubble, there's trouble. Yeah, those are 2 nice catchy ones there. That one was from Janet Stewart. Just flicking through these. Yeah, one that Richard Godlin's had to put in here. I've sat in on many tests, but never heard an examiner ask if his instructions were clear. I've not ever heard that lately now. I think that's one that's gone from what the examiners do now. And that'll be through the training that goes through Cardington. It'll have all moved forwards a lot. Frank Ward says, thank you all. Brilliant experience for my first webinar. Thoroughly enjoyed and learnt. That was from Helen. Thanks, very informative webinar from Andy. Thank you. And that's it for all the questions. So we'll wrap that one up for this evening. Thank you very much for attending and joining us on tonight's webinar. That's been a lot longer than what I thought it was going to be. Well over an hour. Thank you and good night, everybody. So that you can exit from the webinar, on the control panel on the right-hand side at the top of the screen, there'll be a red cross in the top of the box. If you just cross that out, it'll disconnect you from the webinar. And, I better just talk about the next one before you all go. Tuesday, the 26th of July, we'll be talking about T-Grow. Following on from the webinar that we did the last time, we'll be talking about the Grow model and T-Grow and explaining the how to set goals and work with the Grow model. So that's our next webinar that Lynn and myself will be doing, and anybody else that wants to join us off the training team. So thank you, and we'll see you on the 26th of July, hopefully. Good night.
Good night.